Welcome back, you night owls. Tonight we are not walking down a comfortable path of kings and queens, but sloshing through the literal muck they left behind. Imagine standing with me, right now, in the gilded Hall of Mirrors at Versailles, circa 1785. The chandeliers are blazing, reflecting off the diamond-crusted silks of 1,000 courtiers, and the orchestra is playing a delicate minuet. It's a scene of unimaginable luxury, a shimmering display of wealth that defies description. But as you step closer to the velvet draperies, a scent hits you, not the sweet lavender you might expect, but a heavy, sickening mix of unwashed bodies, stale sweat, thick, rancid perfume, and, unmistakably, the ammonia bite of human waste. You look down, and despite the polished marble, you notice the scuffs and stains. This golden cage, this architectural miracle, is fundamentally, disgustingly unsanitary. You realize that to truly exist here, you'd have to train your nose to ignore the constant, pervasive stink of filth. You probably won't survive this journey with your delicate modern sensibilities intact. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And if you're listening live, drop your location and local time in the comments. I love knowing where we're all drifting off together. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You find yourself pressed against the rich tapestry of the court, a silent observer in the most famous palace in the world, the creation of Louis XIV, the Sun King. This wasn't just a home, it was a political tool, designed to keep the thousands of powerful French aristocrats under the king's eye, far from their power bases in the provinces. The sheer number of people living, visiting and working here, upwards of 10,000 on any given day, created a logistics nightmare that the technology of the time simply couldn't handle. It was an instant city dropped into the countryside, and it suffered from all the same problems as Paris, just draped in gold leaf. You are constantly jostled by counts, dukes and their servants, and the contact immediately brings a nervous tingle to your skin. You know instinctively that you are being pressed up against diseases you thought were long dead. The most jarring mainstream historical fact you encounter immediately is the almost total absence of proper, centralized plumbing and sanitation. For a palace that costs the equivalent of billions today, the waste disposal system was basically non-existent. There were a few rudimentary latrines, often in remote wings or courtyards, that they were few and far between and constantly backed up. For the vast majority of courtiers, guests and servants, the solution was terrifyingly simple and repulsive. Wherever you were, you relieved yourself. You see a prominent marquis, mid-conversation, turn discreetly toward a window alcove, lift his heavy coat, and urinate into a decorative urn or down the edge of a tapestry. Servants, even those in high-ranking positions, would often use the grand staircases and corridors as makeshift urinals, especially at night. It was an accepted, if unsavoury, part of life. Imagine the scene: a footman is running a message, and he has to literally jump over a pile of human refuse on the stairs. It's hard for your modern brain to reconcile the artistry of the architecture with the base, animalistic behaviours of its inhabitants. The palace grounds, too, were a public toilet on massive scale. The elegant gardens, celebrated for their design, became foul-smelling minefields. You see why aristocrats carried those little canes? They weren't just for show. They were used to poke the ground ahead of them to ensure they didn't step in anything truly awful. The smell, especially in the humid summer months, must have been overwhelming, even to those who were accustomed to it. The sheer density of humanity, coupled with this absolute lack of sanitary infrastructure, meant that the magnificent palace was, in essence, a beautiful multi-story septic tank. Now, let's talk about the quirky or fringe tidbit that really encapsulates this absurdity. The chaise percée, or pierced chair. This was essentially a portable, velvet-lined commode, a fancy box with a hole and a pot underneath. The quirk is that these weren't necessarily used in private. A highly favoured courtier might have their chaise percée placed right in their bedroom, or even in the corner of a reception room, and would use it while simultaneously holding a conversation, receiving guests or dictating letters. It was a status symbol, to be so important that you didn't have to interrupt your day for a basic bodily function. Your modern self gasps at the casualness of this, the willingness to share such an intimate and inherently smelly moment with others. This public display of private acts was a fundamental part of the aristocratic ethos. This brings us to the core issue of aristocratic belief, the distinction between the interior and exterior self. They believed that they were naturally superior, their inner nobility transcending the common filth of the body. They were so focused on the appearance of grandeur, the clothes, the wigs, the jewels, but the reality of their physical existence was ignored, or perhaps simply masked with increasingly expensive and heavy perfumes. They were living in a constant state of cognitive dissonance, visually stunning but sensually repulsive. As you wander through a particularly ornate salon, you overhear a hushed debate. This touches upon a profound scholarly debate phrase. Historians still argue whether the physical filth of Versailles was a cause or merely a symptom of the monarchy's decline. Some argue that the disconnect from physical reality and the aristocratic inconvenience of bodily functions mirrored their disconnect from the suffering of the populace. Others suggest that the unsanitary conditions were simply a reflection of pre-modern European life everywhere, only magnified by the density of the court, and that linking it directly to the revolution is overly dramatic. You muse that even if it wasn't a direct cause, it certainly provided powerful visceral imagery for the revolutionary pamphlets, a king literally living in his own golden dun. The atmosphere is thick, not just with odour, but with a complex mix of ambition, paranoia and boredom. Courtiers spent their entire lives jockeying for position, and being able to tolerate the filth was a kind of perverse requirement for entry. The king himself, Louis XVI, and his queen Marie Antoinette were certainly not immune to the smell. They may have had the most luxurious apartments, but they were still surrounded by the vast unmanaged ecosystem of the palace. Marie Antoinette, to her credit, was apparently fastidious by the standards of her time, and tried to establish a more rigorous routine for her private apartments. But it was a losing battle against the scale of the problem. Imagine trying to sleep here. You're a noble, tucked into a heavy velvet-draped bed, and you can still hear the rustling and scratching in the walls. It's the vermin, of course, drawn by the refuse and the constant warmth of 10,000 people. The heavy tapestries, which look so majestic, are essentially giant dust and dirt-catching air filters that are never cleaned. The carpets, thick with wool, absorb spilled sweat and bodily fluids, holding the odour in perpetuity. There is no escape. The windows are often sealed shut, especially in winter, to conserve heat, meaning the air you breathe is recycled, heavy and stale, saturated with every single microscopic particle of the palace's life. You feel a sudden, desperate craving for a simple, fresh breeze and a bar of modern soap. But you are trapped for now, in this paradox of wealth and squalor, a world where the most precious commodity was not gold, but a single, genuinely clean lungful of air. You realize your journey is just beginning, and the further we delve into their personal lives, the worse this smell is going to get. You survived the initial shock of Versailles' ambient filth, but now you must witness the aristocratic routine for dealing with their own bodies, the infamous toilette. The word itself suggests cleaning, but the reality is that the 18th century French nobles' approach to hygiene was less about removing dirt and more about expertly layering scents to mask the odours of decay and neglect. You wake up in a noble's apartment, perhaps as a favourite attendant, and the first thing you notice is not the light, but the heavy, cloying air, thick with old body odour and a powerful, musky perfume trying desperately to win the battle. The most profound realisation you have is that for the aristocracy, water is viewed with suspicion. This isn't just because of the lack of indoor plumbing. It's a mainstream historical fact that doctors of the era believed that hot water, especially, opened the pores, allowing bad airs and disease to enter the body. Therefore, the full immersion bath, which you take for granted, was a rarity, reserved more for medicinal purposes or as a decadent pleasure than a routine cleaning ritual. When they did bathe, it was often a complicated, hours-long affair involving herbal infusions and milk, rather than simple soap and water. For daily cleaning, they relied on a toilette sèche, a dry cleaning ritual. You watch as a noble, a duchess perhaps, prepares for the day. Her maids gather around her, not with basins of water, but with piles of fine linen cloths. Her bath consists of rubbing the visible areas of her skin, face, neck and hands, with these cloths, sometimes slightly dampened with rosewater or vinegar, to remove surface dirt. The rest of her body, hidden beneath layers of heavy, restrictive clothing, often went unwashed for weeks, sometimes months at a time. You can't help but shudder, knowing what must be incubating under those heavy silks. The idea of true, deep cleanliness simply did not exist. The dirt was simply pushed around and disguised. Her teeth are another horror show. We will dedicate an entire section to the sugar-ravaged aristocratic mouth. But for now, you observe her dental hygiene. It involves rubbing a small cloth or a sprig of rosemary on the gums and teeth, sometimes using a paste made of soot, brick dust, or salt, abrasives that did more harm than good to the enamel. The results are visible: yellowed, rotten, or missing teeth, which the odour often tried to hide behind a carefully cultivated, reserved smile. The sweet, rotten smell in her breath, despite the mint pastilles she chews, is unmistakable. The hair is where the real fun begins, and it brings us to a crucial quirky or fringe tidbit about aristocratic vanity: the invention and popularity of the facial patch, or mouche, literally, fly. These tiny pieces of black velvet, cut into shapes like stars, hearts, moons, or carriages, were strategically glued onto the face. Ostensibly, they were used to cover up smallpox scars, which were distressingly common even among the nobility. However, the quirk is that they quickly evolved into a sophisticated secret language. A patch near the corner of the eye might signal passion, one on the cheek gallantry, and one on the lip kisses. A woman could communicate her availability, mood, or even political allegiance through the subtle placement of these miniature velvet disguises. They were a fragile, ridiculous mask, trying to distract from the underlying reality of a diseased and unwashed face. The elaborate, sculpted application of white leaden chalk makeup, designed to make the skin look fashionably pale, also served to mask redness, blemishes, and the telltale signs of disease, but it did nothing to allow the skin to breathe. The perfume is the star of this toilette. You watch as a small fortune in eau de toilette and heavy animalic musks, often containing ambergris from whales, or civet from, civet cats, is applied liberally. This wasn't a delicate spritz. It was a dousing, a deliberate attempt to create an impenetrable cloud of scent that could overpower the stench of the body beneath. The fashion was for strong, complex, and long-lasting fragrances. The scent of an aristocrat was their invisible calling card, but in truth, it was more like a chemical weapon in the war against their own pervasive body odour. Everything had to smell clean to distract from the reality that nothing was clean. The wigs, which we'll cover in detail later, are another nightmare. The process of powdering them with starch and flour, often scented with orris root or lavender, happens right there in the room, creating a hazy white film over everything. This powder does help absorb some of the scalp's oils and mask the odour, but it does little for the lice and fleas that have taken up permanent residence in the intricate structure. You watch a servant use a small ivory-handled scratcher to relieve the noble's head beneath the wig. It's an almost continuous, unconscious gesture for many in the court. As you consider the sheer effort expended on appearance versus actual cleanliness, you realise that the aristocratic toilette routine perfectly illustrates the gulf between their self-perception and their reality. It was a performance, a carefully choreographed dance of applying makeup, patches and perfume to an unwashed canvas. This leads us to the crucial scholarly debate phrase. Historians still argue whether the reliance on parfumerie versus savonnerie was a practical response to water quality issues, or a deeper cultural aversion to physical exposure. The water in cities like Paris was often contaminated with sewage and industrial waste, making bathing a risky endeavour for health. So using heavily scented alcohol-based washers and dry cloths might have been a pragmatic choice. However, the extreme modesty and the obsession with formal appearance also suggest a cultural element, where the body, save for the face and hands, was considered inherently vulgar and best left untouched beneath the protective, socially approved layer of clothing. Whichever the reason, the result was a court that shimmered with silk and gold, that reeked of body odour, musk and neglect. The final element of the toilette is the dressing ritual, and here the layers of filth truly begin. The noble wears a fine linen shirt closest to the skin, the only layer that is routinely changed and washed. This linen garment is supposed to act as a buffer, absorbing the body's sweat and oils and keeping them away from the expensive outer layers. However, the outer garments, the heavy silk coats, the embroidered waistcoats, the velvet skirts, are rarely, if ever, cleaned. They are too delicate, too structured, and too costly to wash. Instead, they are brushed, perhaps aired out, or sprayed with more perfume. You realise that a nobleman's court coat could be a museum of his life, holding on to the stains, sweat, and smells of every meal, every ball, and every physical encounter, for months or even years. The cedar duchess finally laced into her heavy stays, the corset, which physically constricts her, creating the fashionable silhouette while also trapping heat and sweat against her torso. This, combined with the heavy, unventilated fabrics, means that she's essentially walking around in a self-made sauna of grime. You can't help but think how much simpler and healthier a 5-minute shower would be, but that simple, effective solution is centuries away. For now, all you can do is hold your breath and watch as she glides away, a majestic walking monument to perfumed filth, a silk rustling carrying the accumulated odours of a week with her. You've witnessed the performance of the toilette, the masking ritual, and now you see the final suffocating step, the donning of the official court attire. This isn't just clothing, it is architecture, a statement of wealth and a mainstream historical fact that the quality and quantity of one's clothing were the most immediate and undeniable sign of one's rank and proximity to the king. You stand in the presence of a noble as they are dressed, and you realise these fabrics aren't merely decorative, they are layers of insulation, social status, and, quite literally, concentrated filth. The foundation is the shift, the simple washable linen shirt or chemise worn next to the skin, the only true defence against the rest of the unhygienic ensemble. But atop this thin barrier comes the structure. For the woman, this means the stays or corset, often made of stiff linen reinforced with whalebone or wood. This garment, already lace tight over the chemise, is designed to mould the body into the fashionable conical shape, pushing the breasts upward and constricting the waist. While serving a structural purpose, it traps heat and moisture against the torso. Imagine wearing a heavy, non-breathable cast all day, every day, in a sweltering palace. The constant sweat and skin oils are absorbed by the fabric, which, because of the complexity of the lacing and the difficulty of drying, is not changed daily. So, the stays become a permanent sweaty retainer of the day's grind. Over the stays and the numerous petticoats, the outer gown is fitted. This is where the expense comes in. Heavy silks, velvets, brocades and taffetas, often embroidered with silver, gold and jewels. These fabrics are so delicate and complex that cleaning them is out of the question. You see the subtle, permanent stains, a splash of wine from a long-forgotten banquet, a smear of grease, the faint watermark from a hurried trip through the rain. These beautiful, elaborate gowns are never truly clean. Instead, they are aired, brushed, and perhaps, as we discussed, sprayed with perfume to mask their accumulated stench. A dress might represent weeks of an artisan's labour and a year's wages for a common worker, and yet it is structurally, fundamentally unhygienic. For men, the layers are equally oppressive. The linen shirt, followed by the tight breeches often silk or velvet, the waistcoat, and finally, the heavy justiciar, the knee-length coat. Just like the women's gowns, these outer pieces are treasures of tailoring, covered in braid and intricate embroidery, and rarely, if ever, washed. The breeches, in particular, are a horror. Tight-fitting and worn close to the skin, they would quickly become saturated with sweat and the inevitable splashes and accidents that occurred in a world with no functional toilet facilities. The noble is literally encased in his own, slowly decomposing finery. You notice something else about the men's attire that acts as a profound quirky or fringe tidbit, the cuffs and lace. The sleeves of the justiciars often ended in massive decorative cuffs, often covered with cascading layers of pristine white lace. This wasn't merely decorative. It served a very specific practical purpose. In a time when men rarely washed their hands thoroughly and ate messily without forks, these cuffs became the most convenient, immediate place to wipe their greasy mouths, fingers and noses. When the cuff became sufficiently soiled, a servant would simply cut off the outermost layer of lace. The lace was, therefore, a disposable napkin and a status symbol, literally representing how much mess a noble could afford to wipe away. It's an image that sticks with you. High fashion is a sophisticated consumable blotter for aristocratic bodily fluids. The weight of this clothing is astonishing. The fabrics are heavy, stiff and restricting. Add to this the weight of the elaborate, metal-framed panniers, wide hoops that gave the women's skirts their enormous width, and you realise that moving gracefully through a crowded room was an act of extreme physical effort. The clothes didn't just restrict movement, they restricted airflow, trapping heat and creating an ideal microclimate for bacteria and the thriving insect life we'll discuss later. A noble could easily lose consciousness from heat exhaustion and restrictive clothing while dancing or even just standing too long in the crowded, unventilated halls of Versailles. When you look closely at the courtier's shoes, the final piece of the ensemble, the disconnect is complete. They wear delicate, high-heeled silk or leather slippers, utterly unsuited for walking on the muddy, sewage-strewn streets outside the palace, or even the often fouled corridors inside. The shoes are part of the ritual, meant to be seen from the bottom of a carriage or glimpsed beneath the hem of a gown, emphasizing the wearer's complete divorce from anything resembling physical labor or practical life. The entire wardrobe serves as a powerful metaphor for their social position. Beautiful, imposing, incredibly expensive, utterly rigid, and completely impractical for real life. It is designed for show, not for function, and certainly not for health. In observing this obsessive focus on exterior glamour, you naturally consider the deeper meaning. This brings us to a significant scholarly debate phrase. Historians still argue whether the grande toilette, the elaborate public dressing ritual, was primarily a function of political control or merely a reflection of the period's material culture. The ritual of the king's lever, waking up, and coucher, going to bed, were high points of court life, where nobles would literally fight to hold the monarch's shirt or hand in his stockings. This elevated the act of getting dressed to a political theatre, ensuring that nobles were constantly dependent on royal favour. Some scholars argue that the clothing's complexity was necessary simply to sustain this political drama, while others maintain that the rigid structure and lavish material were simply what the most advanced textile and fashion industries of the time could produce, driven by demand for spectacle. You, witnessing the sheer physical discomfort and underlying stench, feel that the political necessity was likely the driving force, a way to keep the aristocracy perpetually preoccupied and physically restricted. Even accessories contribute to the overall lack of hygiene. The ubiquitous fan for women was essential, not just as a tool for coy communication, but as a practical device to move the stagnant, odorous air away from one's face. The constant application of pomades, powders, and heavy perfumes to the wigs and the skin meant that the fan's purpose was often less about cooling and more about chemical warfare against the surrounding stench. Think of the sheer logistics of moving such an elaborate wardrobe. Nobles travelled with massive trunks containing hundreds of individual pieces, all of which had to be carefully managed by dozens of servants. The storage areas and servant quarters were crowded, dark and damp, perfect conditions for the proliferation of mildew, moths, and the insects that clung to the wool and silk. So, even when the garments were not being worn, they were often decomposing in storage, waiting to be brought out, shaken off, and reinfused with perfume. You realise that every aristocrat you see is walking around inside a complex layered shell of potential infection. The unwashed clothes act as a second skin, absorbing and retaining the detritus of their lives. It's a dizzying realisation. The very symbols of their power and beauty, the silks, the laces, the heavy embroidery, are also the most powerful indicators of their physical squalor and their total indifference to the common clean body. As the noble finally sweeps away, a veritable walking tapestry, you can almost see the faint cloud of musk and bacteria wafting in their wake, preparing the air for the next scene of this grotesque gilded drama. You've smelled the halls and witnessed the effort that goes into masking the aristocratic body. Now, you are invited to join them at the very heart of their social ritual, the dinner table. This is where their decadence truly shines, a spectacle of excess that is as visually stunning as it is as gastronomically and hygienically revolting. You stand at the edge of the Salon d'Arculay, watching the preparations for a grand supper hosted by a major noble, and the sheer scale of the operation is staggering. The table itself is a masterpiece, laden with silver, crystal, and exotic centerpiece sculptures. But as the dozens of courses begin to arrive, your modern sensibility screams. This is a mainstream historical fact. Despite the introduction of the fork to France centuries earlier, famously by Catherine de' Medici, its adoption was slow and inconsistent, especially for many meats and shared dishes. Many aristocrats still preferred the hands-on approach. You watch as a distinguished duke plunges his fingers directly into a shared bowl of stewed pigeons, pulls out a piece, and tears into it, licking his greasy fingers clean before reaching for the wine goblet. Cable manners, as you understand them, are barely embryonic. The noise is incredible. It's not just the clatter of silverware and the chatter of ambitious courtiers. It's the sound of slurping, gnawing, and spitting. Bones, gristle, and fruit seeds are commonly spat directly onto the floor beneath the table, or occasionally tossed over the shoulder. Remember those elaborate unwashed court coats? They often served as the primary repository for grease and accidental spills. The delicate, high-heeled shoes you saw in the previous section now become traps, navigating a carpet of discarded food waste, wine dregs, and God knows what else. The presence of dogs beneath the table encouraged to scavenge the refuse, only adds to the chaotic, animalistic atmosphere. The food itself is a terrifying display of richness. The aristocratic diet was overwhelmingly meat-heavy and sugar-laden, designed for visual impact and sheer quantity rather than nutritional health. Have you seen mountains of roasted game, pheasants, boars, and deer, elaborately prepared with rich sauces thickened with flour, followed by endless pastries, creams and tarum-spun sugar confections. "We may see," said the word, looking up the path of the deep soft bowl. The sheer volume of food is overwhelming, and the nobles, eager to prove their bon vivant status, rarely show restraint. The lack of fresh vegetables and fruit, often deemed peasant food, or simply too risky to eat unpeeled, contributes to systemic health problems like scurvy and chronic constipation, issues they then treated with even more unhygienic medical interventions, as we will see. One of the most profound, quirky or fringe tidbits concerning this dining excess relates to the phenomenon of the vomiting room, or the dedicated post-meal purging. While the ancient Roman practice of deliberately purging to make room for more food might seem exaggerated, the 18th century French aristocracy certainly had its own form of it. After a massive, several-hour-long feast that physically stuffed them, it was not uncommon for a noble to retire briefly to a side room to induce vomiting, either with a feather or a laxative, specifically so they could return to the table for the final sweet courses or continue their evening's entertainment without agonizing abdominal pain. This wasn't necessarily a widespread daily practice, but the fact that it occurred at all speaks volumes about the level of culinary excess and the bizarre disregard for the body's natural limits. It transforms the feast from nourishment into a literal trial of endurance. The serving practices are another source of disgust. Food safety is a non-existing concept. The kitchen staff, often overworked in hot, unhygienic conditions, had no idea about bacterial contamination. Food was prepared hours in advance and left sitting out, often in warm rooms, before being paraded out. You watch as a footman, who you know hasn't washed his hands in days, grips a loaf of bread to slice it or touches the rim of a platter before presenting it. The king's food was ceremonially checked by tasters to prevent poisoning, but this ritual did nothing to protect against the more common, invisible assassins, bacteria, mould and rot. The wine, consumed in vast quantities, was often the safest to drink, since it was fermented, unlike the often polluted water. It served to sterilize some of the oral cavity, but primarily it served to dull the senses and lubricate the increasingly ribald conversation. As the meal progresses, the formality begins to crack, and the sheer grossness of the dining habits becomes more apparent. You see a noble use his cuff to wipe his nose. Remember that lace cuff we talked about? Which ends up, and then immediately take a drink from a glass shared with his neighbour. The scholarly debate phrase that runs through this scene is, historians still argue whether the elaborate structure of the French aristocratic banquet represented genuine culinary refinement or simply a strategic display of economic and political dominance. Many scholars point out that the focus on highly complex, difficult-to-prepare dishes with exotic ingredients like elaborate pâtés and sugared fruits imported at massive cost was a deliberate, non-verbal way of demonstrating overwhelming wealth and power. The food was less about taste and more about spectacle, designed to awe guests and bankrupt rivals. The sheer waste, vast quantities of uneaten food that were immediately scraped off the table and into the filth, was a fundamental part of the performance. The host had to provide more than anyone could possibly eat to prove their infinite capacity for extravagance. The tables are not cleared or cleaned in the modern sense, they are just serviced. New plates are placed over old messes, and the level of accumulated debris grows with each course. By the end of the meal, the dining room, despite its soaring ceilings in crystal, feels like a pigsty in silk trappings. The air is heavy with the smell of rich, cloying food, spilled wine, and the general heat and perspiration of dozens of overfed bodies. This dining scene is a powerful distillation of the aristocracy's fatal flaw, an unwavering commitment to outward show and pleasure, coupled with a fundamental blindness to the consequences of their actions on their own health, their environment, and ultimately, their kingdom. They literally consume their wealth in a messy, disgusting spectacle, spitting the remnants onto the floor they walk on. You realize that to have such a feast, where every known dish is served, is not an act of appreciation, but an act of conquest over the body and the environment. As you finally step away from the scene, you feel a deep, visceral nausea, a sense that you have just witnessed a truly disgusting form of power being exercised through the gluttonous, unhygienic consumption of everything around it. An image of the greasy hand, dripping sauce reaching for a shared dish, is what you take with you. You've witnessed the aristocrats' public displays of filth in the court and at the table. Now, as the evening draws to a close, you are escorted into the supposed sanctuary of the noble bedchamber. Yet, even here, in the most intimate of spaces, the gilded horror continues. This is not a place of peaceful rest. It is a humid, curtained enclosure that serves as a breeding ground for vermin, disease, and stale air. The aristocratic bed itself is a formidable piece of furniture, a massive structure draped in heavy, expensive velvet or silk curtains, designed for dramatic effect and to trap wolves. This brings us to a crucial mainstream historical fact. The bed curtains were absolutely essential for survival, particularly in cold climates and drafty stone palaces like Versailles. Glass was expensive, and windows were often ill-fitting, leading to relentless drafts. The curtains provided an immediate, if suffocating, buffer against the cold. However, this same warmth and enclosure created a perfect ecosystem for the palace's permanent residents, bedbugs, fleas and lice. As you peer into the bed, you realize the sheets, while perhaps changed more often than the court clothes, were still often shared, used by multiple people over the course of the night or the next day. But the real problem lies in the mattresses and bolsters. These were often stuffed with materials like straw, horsehair or feathers, which were rarely, if ever, replaced or properly cleaned. These organic fillings became magnets for body effluvia, sweat and spilled liquids, and they offered perfect hidden refuge for swarms of insects. The scratching and biting were not an occasional annoyance. They were a persistent daily reality of aristocratic life. Imagine trying to sleep, constantly bothered by a crawling sensation on your skin, knowing that your expensive wig lying on the bedside table is probably a veritable lice mansion. The noble you are observing unconsciously scratches beneath their nightcap, a common accessory worn to keep the hair and any loose wig powder from fouling the sheets, and perhaps to keep the vermin contained. They knew the bugs were there. It was simply an accepted part of their physical existence, another disgusting reality to be endured in a world devoid of effective pest control. The act of going to bed, or the coucher, for high-ranking nobles, particularly the king, was a semi-public event. Courtiers would gather to witness the monarch undress, a final highly ritualized moment of political theatre. Even the noble you observe, though less grand than the king, might have a handful of servants and favoured friends in attendance as they change into a linen nightshirt. This public nature of private life ensured that even the bedchamber, a place we associate with solitude, was never truly private. You are reminded of the general lack of privacy and dignity we saw earlier. Their lives were lived on a stage, even when sleeping. Now, let's look at the profound, quirky or fringe tidbit associated with the aristocratic bedchamber. The piss pot or chamber pot. Well, ubiquitous, the quirk lies in its use and disposal. These ornate ceramic or metal vessels were kept under the bed and used liberally throughout the night, by the noble, their spouse, and occasionally a servant or attendant sleeping in the room. The truly disgusting part is the disposal. Rather than being emptied into a central cesspit, which were where, it was often the duty of the lowest servant to carry the contents out and either dump it into the nearest available open space, the street, the garden, or worst of all, out the window, often with a perfunctory warning cry of, "Get low, watch out for the water," for anyone below. The accumulation of this waste, both in the chamber pots overnight and in the corridors, led to the incredible pervasive smell that assaulted you in the first section. The very instruments of their comfort and necessary bodily relief became vectors of disease and filth for the entire palace. The air quality inside the heavy bed curtains was atrocious. With little ventilation, and the windows sealed against the cold, the air would quickly become heavy with the breath of the occupants. The accumulated body odours of the day and the stale scent of whole satin catastrophic. In the morning, when the curtains were drawn, the resulting rush of putrid air would be a shock. Historians still argue whether the high infant mortality rates among the French aristocracy were more directly attributable to poor nutrition or the chronic lack of ventilation and pervasive disease environment in their living quarters. This scholarly debate phrase highlights the grim reality that their luxurious homes were actually environmental hazards. The enclosed, warm, stagnant air was a perfect vector for airborne diseases like tuberculosis and respiratory illnesses, which were devastating, especially to children, whose immune systems were still developing. You realise that a modern nursery, simply by being clean and well ventilated, is infinitely healthier than the most gilded royal bedchamber of 1780. The presence of disease-carrying insects in the bed was not simply a matter of discomfort, it was a matter of life and death. Fleas, thriving in the warmth and access to blood, were known carriers of diseases like the plague and typhus. They were accepted as a necessary evil, to the point that people would wear small, decorative flea furs, pelts, often of ermine or marten, to theoretically lure the pests away from their bodies. This bizarre fashion accessory only served to keep the vectors of disease even closer. Think back to the heavy fabrics of their court dress. Now imagine those same fabrics as the drapery and lining of their beds. They were rarely washed, only brushed. The velvet, which looks so soft and rich, holds dust, dirt, dander and insect eggs in its pile like a sponge. Every time a noble shifted in the night, they were releasing a puff of microscopic filth into the already contaminated air. The lack of basic pest management meant that the palace was an entire interconnected ecosystem of humans and vermin. The noble was the blood meal, and the vermin were their constant, unwanted companions, from the mouche on the face to the fleas in the bed. This nightly discomfort led to disturbed sleep and chronic fatigue, which certainly didn't help their often volatile, stressed temperaments. As you stand in the noble chamber, the image of their golden life is fully tarnished. The bed, the symbol of rest and security, is revealed to be a hot, stuffy, shared, insect-infested death trap. The luxury is a lie, the comfort is an illusion. They were physically more comfortable than a peasant, perhaps, but they were still deeply and perpetually unclean, and their wealth merely afforded them a more elegant, velvet-lined setting for their suffering. The memory of the unemptied chamber pot, sitting right next to the silk slippers, is the final sickening detail that proves the point. The highest society in France lived on top of its own effluvia. You've survived the smells of Versailles, the layers of unwashed clothing, and the insect life of the bedchamber. Now you must confront the greatest threat to the aristocratic body. Worse than their diet or their habits, the state of their own medicine. Illness was a constant companion in this unsanitary world, and when a noble fell sick, the cures administered were often more dangerous and disgusting than the disease itself. The dominant medical philosophy, a mainstream historical fact, was still largely rooted in the ancient Greek concept of humoral theory. This held that the body was governed by 4 primary fluids or humours: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile, and that illness was caused by an imbalance among them. The doctor's goal, therefore, was not to fight germs, a concept centuries away from acceptance, but to restore this balance, usually through aggressive, invasive, and profoundly unhygienic methods. A most common and terrifying remedy, you observe, is bloodletting. If a noble suffered from a fever, a headache, or almost any ailment, the immediate conclusion was that they had too much hot blood, or blood that was corrupted. The solution was to cut a vein or apply leeches to drain a pint or more of this vital fluid. You watch a physician, often a highly regarded one, apply a lancet, an instrument that is almost certainly unsterilised, perhaps having been used minutes earlier on another patient, to the arm of a visibly weak countess. The sight of her blood spilling into a basin, meant to relieve her, simply makes her weaker and far more vulnerable to infection. Even the most powerful man in France, Louis XIV, endured numerous, often near-fatal bleedings and aggressive purges throughout his life. Complementing bloodletting was the equally brutal practice of purging and emetics. If the humours were out of balance, the doctor felt it necessary to violently expel the contents of the noble's stomach or bowels. You witnessed the horrifying results of a noble being dosed with potent laxatives or powerful emetics derived from herbs and minerals. The resulting sickness, violent vomiting and explosive diarrhea, are seen not as a side effect, but as a sign that the treatment was working, successfully expelling the evil or bad humours from the system. Imagine being desperately ill, and then having your body further traumatized by this violent, dehydrating process. The chamber pots, and sometimes the floor of the sick room, become truly frightful places. This leads us to a crucial, quirky or fringe tidbit that perfectly illustrates the medical madness: the use of mummy powder and crocodile dung. The obsession with exotic, often mythical cures was rampant. Mummy powder, made from ground-up Egyptian mummies, often faked, being ground-up poor people, was widely believed to hold restorative or protective powers and was consumed as a kind of high-status medicinal spice. Similarly, the dried dung of various exotic animals, including the crocodile, which you may remember being referenced earlier, remember that crocodile dung sunscreen, were sometimes incorporated into poultices or ingested, based on bizarre, unverified theories of natural healing. The fact that the wealthy aristocracy was ingesting dried human remains and animal feces speaks volumes about their desperate faith in unproven remedies and their doctors' utter lack of scientific method. The aristocratic patient was surrounded not just by doctors, but by a dizzying array of less reputable figures: apothecaries, barber surgeons, and outright quacks. The barber surgeon, a figure who often performed dentistry, amputations, and bloodletting, was often barely trained and worked with tools that were never sterilized. The line between a respected physician and a charlatan was incredibly thin. Quacks, promising miraculous cures for baldness, venereal diseases, or persistent fevers with secret elixirs and tinctures, flourished among the worried and wealthy, eager to pay enormous sums for hope. The complete absence of germ theory meant that hygiene during any medical procedure was non-existent. The surgeon might wipe his tools on a dirty rag, and the doctor might proceed directly from examining a highly contagious smallpox patient to feeling the pulse of a healthy noble, all without washing his hands. Infection was not understood as transmissible, it was simply fate or the body's natural course. If a patient died, it was because the humours were too far gone, not because the doctor had introduced a fatal infection via a dirty lancet. You overhear a tense exchange among a group of learned men discussing the high rate of post-operative deaths, even for routine procedures like setting a bone. This introduces the profound scholarly debate phrase. Historians still argue whether the laissez-faire attitude of 18th century French physicians towards patient cleanliness stemmed from genuine intellectual conviction in humoral theory or a systemic failure of medical education. Some argue that the physicians, many trained in prestigious universities, genuinely believed that cleansing the interior with purges was far more important than cleaning the exterior. Others counter that the educational system was stagnant, teaching centuries-old dogma and failing to incorporate early emerging empirical observations about hygiene and wound care, leading to a culture of educated arrogance that rejected basic practical cleanliness. Regardless, the outcome for the patient was the same: a high chance of death from iatrogenic doctor-caused infection. Even the most basic health advice was often contradictory and bizarre. You remember the early suspicion of water. Many doctors actively advised against bathing, believing it weakened the constitution. They prescribed constant internal dosing with exotic and often poisonous substances. Mercury, for example, was a common, though highly toxic treatment for syphilis, a disease that, due to the sexual freedom of the court, was horrifyingly common. The side effects of mercury poisoning, tremors, madness, loss of teeth, were often mistaken for the progression of the disease itself. To be an aristocratic patient in 18th century France was to live in a constant, desperate loop. The unsanitary living conditions caused illness, the unscientific medical treatments exacerbated it, and the lack of sanitation in the treatment process often delivered the final, fatal blow. Their immense wealth, which could buy them the finest silk, the grandest homes, and the most celebrated doctors, could not buy them a single genuinely clean procedure or an effective cure. It could only buy them a more expensive, more dramatic, and often more painful death. He realized that their gilded life was balanced on an incredibly fragile foundation, constantly threatened by the unseen world of microbes and the ignorance of the men paid to keep them alive. You have now journeyed through the aristocratic body's neglect and the disastrous state of their medical care. The next layer of their magnificent facade to peel back is the one sitting atop their heads, the incredible, often monumental wig. This accessory, far from being a purely aesthetic choice, was a pragmatic solution to a deeply disgusting problem, yet it created far more repulsive realities than it solved. The era you are observing, particularly the mid to late 18th century, is the zenith of the wig, or peruke, which was a mainstream historical fact made fashionable by Louis XIV as he went prematurely bald, a side effect of syphilis. Some historians speculate. For both men and women, the wig served as a total disguise for the state of the natural hair beneath, which, due to the aversion to washing and the lack of proper hygiene, was often greasy, matted, and heavily infested with vermin. To wash and meticulously care for one's own long hair was a time-consuming, difficult, and medically discouraged practice. So shaving the head or keeping the hair very short and covering it became the path of least resistance. The construction of these wigs was astounding. For men, they were often tight-fitting, powdered, curled creations that reached shoulder length or more. For women, especially leading up to the Revolution, the styles became architectural marvels. The pouf, towering sculpted arrangements that could reach 3 feet or more in height, decorated with miniature ships, gardens, or elaborate scenes. These weren't worn for a day, they were worn for weeks, sometimes months, only occasionally taken down for repair and restyling. Inside these structures, a horrific ecosystem thrived. The natural hair beneath was often coated in heavy pomade, a thick, sticky grease made of animal fats, like bear or beef tallow, and scented with essential oils to mask the rancidity of the fat and the smell of the unwashed scalp. This pomade served 2 purposes: to help the wig sit securely and to feed and anchor the hair. It also, however, provided an ideal warm, moist, and nutrient-rich environment for lice, fleas, and other parasitic insects. The noble's wig was, in reality, a veritable lice mansion. You observe a lady of the court, magnificent in her towering pearl-encrusted pouf. As she speaks, she casually uses a long, thin, often silver or ivory-handled scratcher, a quirky or fringe tidbit known as a grattoir, to poke through the massive padded creation to relieve the persistent itching on her scalp beneath. This wasn't a hidden act. It was commonplace, a recognised tool of courtly life. Occasionally, a servant might be tasked with the horrifying job of removing the wig and using fine combs to mutually harvest the lice and their mitts eggs. The powder, a mixture of flour or starch, sometimes scented, was supposed to help dry out the grease and absorb the scalp's oils, but it also served to obscure the sight of the crawling inhabitants. When the wig was brushed or shook, a fine cloud of white powder, often mixed with skin flakes and insect dust, would be released into the surrounding air. The sheer effort required to maintain these unhygienic sculptures speaks to the aristocracy's obsession with appearances over comfort. Wigs were expensive, difficult to clean, and required the constant attention of specialized wig-makers perruquiers. When stored, they were placed on wooden blocks and covered with gauze, not to protect them from dust, but to try and contain the infestations from spreading to other parts of the room. The wig, therefore, became a powerful visible symbol of their status, built on a foundation of profound physical squalor. For men, the daily application of the white powder was also a source of filth. The powdering was often done in the open, requiring them to cover their expensive silks with a protective cloth, the poudroir, as servants literally threw handfuls of scented starch at their heads. This fine dust settled on the furniture, the floor, the food, and of course their lungs. The aristocrat was constantly breathing in this flour-based dust, which contributed to respiratory issues in the already poorly ventilated palace. The health consequences were severe. The constant irritation and open sores from scratching, combined with the lack of sanitation and the use of unwashed tools, meant that scalp infections were a constant danger. Furthermore, the wigs, being essentially unwashed hair from other, often unknown sources, were themselves carriers of disease and parasites. The noble was literally importing filth onto their head in the name of fashion. As you reflect on this bizarre fashion choice, you recognize a fascinating scholarly debate phrase. Historians still argue whether the 18th century fashion for highly visible parasites, such as the lice in the wigs, was a complete accident of hygiene or a subtle, perverse demonstration of immunity and excess. Some scholars suggest that, like their ability to tolerate the stench of Versailles, enduring the lice was simply a part of the rough-and-tumble physical reality of the pre-modern world, made worse by the fashion. Others propose that in a society where you constantly proved your wealth by spending, the ability to wear an expensive wig and not care about its infestation signalled a level of detachment and luxury, that they had the resources to hire people to clean the filth, even if they often failed to do so properly. The acceptance of the grattoir as a common tool suggests that they saw the problem, but preferred to manage the symptom, the itch, rather than cure the root cause, the filth. The final realization about the wig is its role in reinforcing the social hierarchy. Only the wealthy could afford the fine horsehair, human hair, and massive amounts of powder needed for these creations, and only they could afford the services of the perruquier and the attendants required to maintain them. The lower classes, who could not afford to shave their heads and buy wigs, relied on simple caps and their own, often unsuccessful efforts. Thus, the extravagant, dirty wig crawling with life was ironically a brilliant badge of aristocratic exclusivity. They lived in a world where the dirt on your head was directly proportional to the size of your fortune, and the bigger the wig, the bigger the lie of their cleanliness. You've explored the layers of aristocratic filth, from the unwashed body beneath the silks to the teeming life within the wigs. Now, step back and observe the shocking environment in which these unhygienic people lived, a life of constant suffocating publicity, where the line between private and official life was almost non-existent, and acts we consider utterly private were performed with an audience. This enforced lack of privacy only amplified the reality of their disgusting habits. The court of Versailles, and indeed the homes of the highest nobles, operated on the principle that the closer one was to the king's person, a greater one's status. This proximity was measured not in miles, but in access to the most intimate royal moments. The most profound mainstream historical fact defining courtly life was the levee, the king's waking and the coucher, the king's going to bed. These were grand, highly ritualized ceremonies, attended by dozens, sometimes hundreds of courtiers, who had earned the right to watch the monarch perform the most mundane acts of his life. Imagine being one of those select nobles present for the levee. He watches the king wakes up, his linen nightshirt likely the only clean item on his person. You witness him being shaved, powdered, releasing that cloud of dirt and flour we discussed earlier, and dressed. A duke might have the singular honour of handing the king his shirt, or a high-ranking count might be allowed to pull on his stocking. These were not just customs, they were opportunities to speak briefly to the king, to make a request. It seems to add to the king to prove one's face and prove one's influence. The most private moments, the monarch's physical vulnerability, his morning breath, his body odour before the heavy perfumes were applied, were entirely public spectacles. This expectation of public life trickled down through the entire aristocracy. Your own bedchamber, if you were a favoured noble, was not a place of solitude. You received guests while still in bed, conducted business while being dressed by your femme de chambre, and even wrote letters while using the chaise percée in the corner. Remember that velvet-lined portable commode? The aristocracy saw their bodies not as something to be hidden, but as the central visible symbol of their status. To be seen, even in a compromising, unhygienic situation, was better than being forgotten. The result of this constant surveillance was a profound loss of personal dignity. Bodily functions which we now instinctively perform in solitude were negotiated in front of others. You might witness a group of nobles clustered together, conducting a serious political discussion, while one of them, mid-sentence, turns slightly and relieves himself into a planter or an unused fireplace. This was not a lapse in manners, it was the practical reality of living in a magnificent building with no sufficient waste disposal system, and an entire social structure that demanded you never left your post. The need to maintain one's presence and access to the powerful trumped the simple desire for cleanliness or privacy. The pervasive, inescapable stench of the palace, the result of this public and constant disposal of waste, was something everyone had to manage. This brings us to a significant quirky or fringe tidbit related to social interaction. The highly complex and often contradictory use of the fan and the snuff box. The ladies' fan was used not merely to cool themselves, but strategically to waft the heavy, cloying perfume toward a conversation partner, while simultaneously blocking the worst of the surrounding stench from their own nose. For the men, the ritual of taking snuff, pounded tobacco, was nearly universal. While a social grace, the intense smell of the snuff, combined with its ability to induce a strong sneeze, and the need for a handkerchief, often a decorative, highly scented cloth, served as a powerful sensory distraction. By inhaling a sharp, medicated scent, they temporarily overwhelmed their sense of smell, allowing them to better tolerate the foul odours of the court. The constant cycle was to create a stink body odour, animal grease, unwashed clothes, then use an intense scent, musk, perfume, snuff to mask it, then repeat. The scholarly debate phrase that emerges from this intense public existence is, historians still argue whether the extreme publicity of aristocratic life was a deliberate psychological strategy by the monarch to neuter opposition, or an organic consequence of French pre-modern architectural design. Some scholars, following the philosopher Michel Foucault, argue that Louis XIV shrewdly turned intimacy into a tool of power, forcing the nobility to compete for his attention, and thus distracting them from plotting against him. Others point out that older castles were often designed with communal living in mind, and the subsequent lack of corridors, small private rooms, and indoor plumbing was simply an expensive oversight that the aristocracy, already obsessed with being seen, was happy to exploit as a means of status display. The result, in any case, was a court where physical privacy and cleanliness were sacrificed on the altar of political and social ambition. Even the way they managed their illnesses reflected this public need. When a noble was sick, the Salle de Malades was not a sterile, isolated hospital room. The sick noble was still required to receive visitors and manage their household affairs from their bed. This meant that highly infectious diseases like smallpox, which ravaged the court and left many survivors scarred, hence the use of those facial patches we discussed earlier, were easily spread to visitors who came to pay their respects and ensure their position at court remained secure. The disease, like their daily functions, was a public event, a testament to the fact that their body belonged to the social structure, even in decay. You realize that the aristocrats were trapped. They could afford everything, but they could not afford to be clean, and they could not afford to be alone. Their wealth encased them in layers of beautiful unwashed fabrics and confined them to magnificent stinking halls, forcing them into a relentless cycle of public display and physical indignity. Every moment was a performance, and the pervasive filth of their unmanaged bodies and their surroundings was simply the nauseating soundtrack to the show. The image that lingers is a beautiful woman, magnificently coiffed and dressed, subtly using her grattoir to scratch her infested scalp, a puff of perfumed powder and insect dust floating into the air as she converses, all while the faint, acidic smell of old urine drifts from a nearby potted plant. You've witnessed the aristocrats' daily acts of public squalor, but the source of the persistent stench and disease is a systemic failure that stretches far beyond their personal habits. The catastrophic state of water management, both for drinking and for waste disposal. You step out of the inner court and into the city of Versailles, and then, in your mind's eye, a slightly less gilded noble home, and you realize the problem is universal. The French aristocracy lived in a world where water was simultaneously the source of life and the primary vector of death. The central, alarming, mainstream historical fact is that the water supply in 18th century French cities, and even the supposedly controlled environment of Versailles, was constantly and heavily polluted with sewage. There was no concept of separating drinking water sources from human and animal waste disposal. In Paris, the Seine River, which supplied much of the city's drinking water, was also used as a vast open sewer. Similarly, at Versailles, the sheer volume of human waste generated by the thousands of inhabitants had to go somewhere, and that somewhere was often directly into the grounds, the decorative canals, and any nearby open water source. The most shocking reality you encounter is the direct, unmanaged disposal of human waste. We've already mentioned the infamous practice of tossing chamber pot contents out of windows with a warning cry, "Remember the Gerlot warning." This was not just a few careless servants. It was a widespread accepted practice that turned streets and alleyways into perpetually foul, slippery trenches. In the grander residences, cesspits were sometimes used, but these were rudimentary, often leaking and rarely emptied or maintained properly, leading to the seepage of raw sewage into surrounding soil, and crucially, into the groundwater. For the aristocracy, the suspicion of water was not entirely rational. They didn't understand germ theory, but they could observe that drinking bad water led to violent illness, and bathing in it made skin conditions worse. Their solution was to avoid it almost entirely for internal consumption, relying instead on wine, beer or cider, fermented beverages that were safer because the process of fermentation killed most pathogens. For their coffee, tea or chocolate, water had to be boiled, but this was a labour-intensive process, and often not done with the necessary rigour, especially for the lower-ranking servants. The resulting lack of sanitation meant that epidemics were not the occasional disaster, they were a constant, anticipated feature of life. Diseases like cholera, typhoid, and various forms of dysentery, all waterborne, swept through the population, striking down the rich and poor alike. The nobles' expensive perfume and silk clothes were no defence against a glass of contaminated water. The quirky or fringe tidbit that perfectly encapsulates this engineering failure is the sheer doomed ambition of Louis XIV's efforts to solve the Versailles water problem. To feed the hundreds of fountains and water features in the famous gardens, which were themselves a political statement of power, the Sun King commissioned massive, complex and hugely expensive engineering projects. Most famously, the Machine de Molay. This system was designed to lift water from the Seine River to Versailles. The quirk is the paradox. An army of engineers and a vast treasury were dedicated to providing water for spectacle, for splashing fountains and decorative cascades, while the basic, life-saving requirement of providing clean, potable water for the thousands of human beings who lived and worked there was largely ignored. The decorative water was abundant. The clean drinking water was scarce and filthy. It was a perfect display of priorities that valued the aesthetic performance of power over the basic health of the populace. The very architecture of the palaces exacerbated the crisis. Built of porous stone and with vast empty spaces, they acted as sponges for the filth. The walls and flooring of Versailles, despite the grandeur, absorbed decades of spilled wine, body effluvia, and unmanaged human waste. The only way to temporarily combat the resulting smell was, once again, the relentless burning of aromatic woods and incense, and the application of more perfume to everything. The ultimate olfactory band-aid on a septic wound. This leads us to a fascinating scholarly debate phrase. Historians still argue whether the aristocracy's persistent failure to invest in sanitation technology stem from genuine cost prohibitions or a deep-seated cultural rejection of the messiness of industrial-scale cleaning. Some scholars suggest that the necessary investment for a fully plumbed city was simply too great for the pre-industrial economy, especially given the continuous cost of constant warfare and palace building. Others argue that the nobility, who valued appearances above all else, simply found the concept of extensive visible plumbing, drains, pipes, sewers to be aesthetically offensive and culturally beneath them. The focus was on exterior beauty, not interior function, leading to a system that was splendidly decorative but functionally lethal. Think of the servants, the invisible victims we will discuss later, whose entire existence was defined by this sanitation failure. Their job often involved handling the filth of their masters, emptying chamber pots, carrying waste, scrubbing fouled materials. They were the first to be exposed and the most frequent victims of the waterborne and contact diseases. The aristocrats' waste became the servants' death sentence. The cycle of disgust is complete. The unwashed noble generates waste. That waste is carelessly dumped into the immediate environment. The local water supply becomes contaminated. The noble drinks the water or the poor quality wine. The noble falls ill, and the unhygienic doctors apply medieval cures to the waterborne disease. The water crisis was not a simple inconvenience. It was the unseen ticking clock on the health and stability of the entire social structure. You leave the area around the noble home, and the overwhelming feeling is one of profound environmental toxicity. The air is stale and heavy, the ground is soft with filth, and the sight of a noble lady stepping out of her carriage onto a plank laid over a puddle of sewage, and then gliding away in her spotless silk dress, is the final, perfect image of their impossible cognitive dissonance. Their gold-plated lifestyle was quite literally built atop a mountain of their own excrement. You've traced the filth from the grand halls to the water supply, and now we must acknowledge the final furry contributors to the palace's repulsive environment, the numerous pets the French aristocracy kept, often in their private apartments. While these animals provided companionship and a break from the relentless formality of court, they also introduced an astonishing amount of dirt, disease, and waste into an environment that was already at its breaking point. The aristocratic penchant for keeping pets, a mainstream historical fact, was not merely for affection, it was a fashion statement and a status symbol. The favourite creatures were small, decorative dogs, particularly breeds like the Cavalier King Charles Spaniel, pugs, and miniature terriers. These were carried everywhere, slept in the noble's bed, adding their own contribution to the insect problem, and were dressed in tiny, expensive collars and coats. However, the habit extended far beyond dogs. Nobles frequently kept exotic birds, caged monkeys, and even domesticated rodents. Imagine the apartment of a particularly influential duchess. You find yourself navigating around cages, droppings, and the inevitable smell of unmanaged animal waste. These animals were rarely house-trained by modern standards. Their urine and feces were managed in the same haphazard way as human waste, scooped up and tossed out the window, or simply left to be absorbed by the uncleaned rugs and wooden floors. The dogs, allowed to run freely, would urinate on tapestries and furniture, the resulting odour merging with the human stench into a single complex perfume of decay. The sheer volume of animals meant that fleas and ticks, already a problem thanks to the human hosts, thrived in the environment. The animals acted as permanent reservoirs, constantly reinfesting the palace. Their bedding, often simple straw or fabric scraps, was rarely cleaned or replaced, becoming another perfect breeding ground for parasites. The feeding of these pets also contributed to the filth. Dogs were fed rich scraps from the table, remember that gut-busting cuisine, which often led to various digestive upsets, resulting in even more unpleasant messes for the servants to manage. Uneaten food would quickly rot in the warm, stagnant air, attracting rodents and providing additional breeding sites for flies and other pests. This leads us to a profound, quirky or fringe tidbit regarding the aristocracy's emotional attachment to their pets, even in the face of disease: the practice of co-sleeping with dogs to treat illness. In a time of deeply unscientific medicine, remember that medical mayhem we discussed? And some nobles, desperate for relief from various fevers or chills, believed that the animal's body heat, or perhaps some unknown essence, could draw the sickness out of them. A small dog, particularly a spaniel, would be placed directly on the noble's stomach or chest in bed, while offering warmth. This practice obviously exposed the already sick noble to the animal's full complement of parasites and potential infections, turning their beloved pet into an additional health risk. It highlights the aristocracy's willingness to resort to bizarre, superstitious methods when the rational ones failed. The presence of exotic pets, particularly monkeys, created unique and disgusting problems. These animals, difficult to contain and highly prone to spreading tropical diseases, were fashionable but utterly unsuitable for palace life. Monkeys would routinely soil furniture, rip apart silks, and generally cause chaos. Their waste, different from dogs, was even more pungent and difficult to clean. Keeping them was a statement of extraordinary wealth and access to global trade, but came at the cost of further degrading the already toxic living environment. As you consider this cavalcade of pampered, unsanitary animals, you realize that the aristocracy deliberately chose to magnify the hygienic challenges of their lives. They had the means to provide separate, cleaner quarters for their animals, but they preferred them in close, constant proximity, seeing their tolerance for the resulting mess as part of their casual indifference to the rules that governed common life. This introduces a subtle, yet crucial scholarly debate phrase. Historians still argue whether the proliferation of household pets among the French nobility symbolized their emotional detachment from human relationships, or simply reflected a fashionable imitation of royal precedent. Some scholars suggest that in the highly rigid, politically fraught world of court, the unconditional affection of a pet offered a necessary emotional escape from the human backstabbing and formality. Others argued that, like so many other aspects of their lives, it was pure trend. The king had dogs, so the duke must have dogs too. The true significance, you observe, lies in the consequences. The love for their pets led directly to an increase in the filth and disease that permeated their magnificent homes. The servants, once again, bore the brunt of this. It was the lowest-ranking staff who were responsible for feeding the animals, cleaning up their messes, and managing the resulting infestations. Their quarters, being the warmest and dirtiest in the palace, often became the epicenter of the flea and lice outbreaks that originated with the animals. The aristocratic pet, therefore, was not merely a source of aesthetic filth, it was another clear vector of class-based disease transmission. Think of a grand reception, with dukes and duchesses in their towering wigs and diamond-encrusted silks. Beneath the rustling skirts, small scruffy dogs are sniffing at spilled food scraps, shaking off fleas onto the expensive carpets, and occasionally relieving themselves against the wall. The entire scene is a study in magnificent dissonance, a blinding display of artificial beauty literally undercut by the base, natural mess created by their indulged animal companions. The nobles' physical world, from their heads to their floors, was a thriving, unmanaged zoo of parasites and pets, and they loved it precisely because they could afford to ignore the resulting disgust. You have explored the indoor filth of the aristocratic life, but their pursuit of pleasure did not end at the palace doors. The French nobility was passionately devoted to outdoor pursuits, especially hunting, which, while escaping the immediate stench of Versailles, paradoxically brought even more filth, disease, and primal savagery back into their gilded existence. The hunt was not a simple sport. It was a deeply ingrained social and political ritual, a mainstream historical fact that demonstrated physical prowess, control over the land, and the nobles' absolute right to the country's resources. Louis XVI and the other high-ranking nobles spent countless hours hunting stag, boar, and smaller game in the royal forests. You join a hunting party on a chilly morning, witnessing the initial splendor, magnificent horses, liveried servants, expensive firearms, and a massive pack of hounds. However, the glamour quickly fades. You realize that a noble on the hunt, dressed in heavy, layered riding gear, is deliberately exposing himself to conditions that guarantee deep, pervasive dirt. They're plunging through muddy forests, splashing through streams, and spending hours in close proximity to sweating horses and dozens of barking, often aggressive hounds. Their hunting clothes, while practical, are still made of thick wool and leather, materials that absorb mud, sweat, and animal effluvia, and are, like their court clothes, rarely properly washed. The coat and breeches worn for the hunt become a thick, dirty shell, a reservoir of biological matter from the forest. The most visceral aspect of the hunt is the inevitable blood and gore. The chase ends in the bloody spectacle of the kill, often followed by a ritualistic carving of the carcass, a messy affair known as the corée. The nobleman, or at least his direct attendants, is covered in the animal's blood, viscera, and the dirt from the kill site. This is celebrated, not shunned. They ride back to the palace triumphant, but they are also returning coated in animal blood, carrying the raw, microbial content of the forest with them right back into the pristine antechimbers and slones. The pack of hounds is the most significant vector of outdoor filth. These animals, essential for the hunt, lived in large kennels that were themselves notoriously unsanitary. They were fed raw offal and lived in crowded conditions, ensuring they were perpetually infested with fleas, ticks, and worms. The dogs, when they were not hunting, were often brought right back into the palace courtyards, and even the private apartments, remember the pets in residence, to be petted and admired, immediately transferring their parasites and any pathogens they picked up in the forest to their noble owners in the palace environment. The noble would pet the hound, covered in mud and blood, and then casually touch his own face or food. The exposure to the animal world carried severe health risks, but the aristocracy had no means of understanding. This is where we encounter a chilling, quirky or fringe tidbit, the constant threat of rabies. Hunting dogs, often fighting with wild animals like foxes and wolves, were highly susceptible to this terrifying fatal disease. When a prized hound was bitten, the noble and his servants were often involved in its subsequent care or disposal. A simple scratch or lick from an infected asymptomatic dog could transmit the virus, leading to a horrible, unavoidable death. The love of their hunt and their hounds exposed them to a genuine primal horror that their advanced society was powerless to prevent or cure. The fact that the aristocracy regularly risked this hideous death for the sake of sport is a testament to their profound disconnection from biological reality. Furthermore, the forest itself was a source of disease. Ticks carry Lyme disease and other fevers. Standing in wet, cold gear for hours during the hunt, exposed into the elements, leading to chronic respiratory illnesses, which were often exacerbated by the poor air quality back at court. The hunt was an exhilarating release from the stiffness of court life, but it was physically demanding and medically risky. The contrast between the extreme formality of the court and the raw, unwashed physicality of the hunt introduces a key scholarly debate phrase. Historians still argue whether the noble's devotion to the hunt was a genuine expression of ancient feudal masculinity or a compensatory psychological escape from the emasculating, confined ritual of court life. Some argue that the hunt was a necessary safety valve, allowing the noble to reaffirm his martial, controlling identity, which was otherwise suppressed by the demands of Versailles' elaborate etiquette and political manoeuvring. Others suggest it was simply tradition and a practical way to manage game populations. But you, watching the mud-splattered, sweat-soaked, blood-stained noble return to the palace, see the act as a temporary and very physical repudiation of the clean, ordered facade. The filth of the forest was, in a strange way, more real to them than the golden filth of the palace. The post-hunt ritual was as revealing as the hunt itself. The mud and blood-soaked clothes, too precious to wash thoroughly, were merely brushed down and perhaps aired in the stable yard. The noble might take a minimal bath with scented cloths, but the deeper filth remained embedded in the leather, the wool, and the thick grime on their skin beneath the layers. They then returned to the drawing-room, often still smelling faintly of sweat, horse, and blood, mixing with the heavy musk perfume they immediately applied, a primal, animal scent overlaying the human effluvia. You watched the nobleman, fresh from this exhilarating, filthy ordeal, sit down to dinner with his hands still possibly carrying the grime of the field, reinforcing the lack of sanitation at the table. Remember the forks and filth? The entire cycle of aristocratic life is one of generating dirt, regardless of the setting, and then covering it up with performance and perfume. The hunt provided a temporary relief from the boredom of the court, but only reintroduced the wild, unmanaged dirt of the natural world into the heart of the palace, further complicating the already critical hygienic disaster they called home. You've witnessed the adult aristocratic life, a cycle of magnificent filth, but to truly understand the depth of the era's hygienic horror you must look to the children. The aristocratic approach to childhood was one of profound neglect. a cold, formal existence defined by distance, fashion, and most crucially, a system that outsourced the most fundamental aspects of early life, leading to shocking rates of illness and death. The central, horrifying mainstream historical fact defining aristocratic infancy was the near-universal practice of sending infants away to wet nurses. For a noblewoman, breastfeeding her own child was seen as something vulgar, peasant-like, and a distraction from her primary duty, maintaining her social and political position at court. It was believed to ruin the fashionable figure and interrupt the relentless social calendar. So as soon as possible after birth, sometimes within days, the child was entrusted to a wet nurse, often a woman from the countryside or a lesser village, and shipped away to live in her home, sometimes for years. This practice, while socially convenient for the mother, was a death sentence for countless infants. The conditions in the wet nurses' homes were often desperately poor and unsanitary. Remember the appalling streets and the water crisis? Far worse than the palace, which at least had thick walls and servants. The nurse herself might be ill, malnourished, or simply too busy with her own life and children to provide rigorous care. The journey to the country was often perilous for a fragile newborn, and the subsequent lack of immediate personalised care meant that mortality rates for children put out to wet nurse were dramatically higher than those who stayed at home, sometimes exceeding 50%. The parents knew this, but the cultural imperative of fashion and court life trumped basic parental instinct. When the children returned, usually around the age of 2 or 3, they entered a world of cold formality. The affection that you associate with parenthood was absent, replaced by a rigid system of tutors, governesses, and strict etiquette. The children were dressed in miniature versions of adult clothing. Recall the stifling, unwashed courtly dress, which, being equally heavy and restrictive, often hindered movement and growth. Boys were soon put into tight breeches and coats, and girls into miniature stays, perpetuating the uncomfortable, unhygienic fashion cycle from birth. The hygiene of the aristocratic child was surprisingly often worse than the adults. While adults were masked by perfume and powder, children's less tolerant bodies suffered more visibly. They were subject to the same medical malpractice. Remember the bleeding and purges? At the first sign of illness, which was frequent due to the wet nurse system and the environment of the palace. The physical state of the aristocratic child's bed and environment mirrored the adults, shared, uncleaned beds, full of vermin and poorly ventilated nurseries. There was a particular, unsettling, quirky or fringe tidbit associated with the toilet training of these children. The use of pot chairs that were essentially miniature versions of the chaise per se, but often left, used and unemptied, for long periods in the nursery. The quirk is the deliberate, total reliance on the servant to manage the child's waste, reinforcing the child's detachment from their own bodily functions and creating yet another localized stench zone right where the child slept and played. The child was simply another piece of property to be managed by a hired staff, and their care was defined by the convenience of the servant rather than the need for cleanliness. The resulting psychological distance between parent and child was vast. The noble mother, having delegated the foundational care of her infant, often struggled to form a strong attachment when the child returned as a toddler. This detachment led to a cycle where the child was primarily used as a tool for alliance and inheritance, rather than an object of affection, further reinforcing the cold, self-serving nature of the aristocracy. The child was groomed for the court from the day they returned, their natural curiosity and energy suppressed by the iron cage of etiquette. The pervasive, inescapable disease environment of Versailles, coupled with the poor medical care and the trauma of the wet nurse system, meant that children were constantly ill. The fear of smallpox in particular was constant. Remember the facial patches to hide the scars, and aristocratic families frequently lost multiple children. This grim reality gives rise to the necessary scholarly debate phrase. Historians still argue whether the aristocracy's high infant mortality was an inevitable consequence of pre-modern medical limits, or a cultural choice rooted in systemic neglect and the prioritization of social status. While medicine was undoubtedly primitive, the deliberate choice to send children to environments known to be highly dangerous, the wet nurse's poor cottage, combined with the neglect of basic sanitation in the palace, suggests that cultural choice played a significant and arguably preventable role in the high death rates. The child's life was disposable compared to the mother's career at court. Even in their play, the children were exposed to filth. Toys, often elaborate and beautiful, were shared, uncleaned, and carried germs. The noble child's hands, like their parents', were rarely washed properly, and their contact with the dogs and the general dirt of the palace ensured a constant flow of contamination. The image that lingers is heartbreaking. A beautiful, pale child, dressed like a miniature adult in scratchy velvet, sitting rigidly in a draughty salon, far from the warmth of a parent's lap, constantly scratching an itchy scalp under a powdered wig, already bearing the physical and emotional scars of a life defined by coldness and filth. The disgusting lives of the French aristocrats began, not in adulthood, but in an early, vulnerable, and deeply neglected childhood. You've surveyed the neglect of the aristocratic child and the horror of their early years. Now, let's peer into their mouths. The aristocratic diet, defined by its lavish excess, remember the dining decadence, created a dental disaster that was both agonizingly painful and shockingly visible, another physical manifestation of their destructive lifestyle. The state of their teeth provides one of the clearest, most visceral evidences of their separation from basic health. The primary culprit is a powerful yet delicious mainstream historical fact: the massive unchecked consumption of sugar. As European colonies expanded and trade routes opened, sugar became readily available, transforming from a rare medicinal luxury to a staple of the aristocratic diet. It was used not just in desserts and pastries, but in sauces, preserves, cordials, and even main courses. The nobles consumed extraordinary amounts of refined sugar every day, a constant sticky assault on their teeth. The consequences were immediate and visible: widespread rampant dental decay. Caries, abscesses, and gum disease were near universal. If you were to observe a gathering of high-ranking French aristocrats, you would be struck by the dark, rotten, or missing teeth that afflicted even the most beautiful and expensively dressed courtiers. The famous reserved smiles of the era were not merely a matter of etiquette. They were a necessary tactic to hide a horrific truth. The methods of dental hygiene were woefully inadequate and often counterproductive. While some nobles used the aforementioned cloths rubbed with salt or sage, others relied on highly abrasive pastes made from ingredients like brick dust, charcoal, or soot, substances that did little to clean but were effective at wearing down precious enamel, thus accelerating decay. The lack of proper tools, like modern brushes, and the complete absence of any understanding of bacterial plaque meant that the fight against decay was a lost cause from the moment they had their first sugared coffee. The pain from these rotten teeth must have been constant and excruciating. Fevers from abscesses were a frequent, dangerous occurrence, often leading the noble to seek out the services of the unqualified barber surgeon. Remember the medical mayhem. Hugh, lacking anesthetic and a proper understanding of sterilization, would often simply yank the offending tooth out with primitive, dirty forceps. The procedure was traumatic, often leading to broken jaws, severe bleeding, and potentially fatal infections. You realize that a simple toothache, which a modern person solves with an over-the-counter painkiller, was a major life-threatening crisis for a French noble. The grotesque appearance of their mouths led to a particular fascinating quirky or fringe tidbit: the rise of false teeth made of human or animal material. To cover the gaps, wealthy nobles invested in dentures, but these were crude and often ineffective. The teeth were made from a variety of unsettling materials, including carved animal bones such as ivory from walrus or hippopotamus, porcelain which was fragile, or, most shockingly, human teeth extracted from the deceased, often poor people, were even collected from the corpses left on battlefields. The latter were considered the most desirable because of their natural appearance. Imagine the bizarre transaction: buying the teeth of a dead, often young person to replace your own sugar-rotted ones. These dentures, difficult to keep clean, would often slip, discolour quickly, and add another element of unsanitary foreign material to the noble's mouth. The combination of putrefying food, infected gums, and the occasional use of decaying animal or human teeth meant that the aristocratic breath, their halitosis, was often truly foul, merging the sweet rot of sugar with the stink of infection. This pervasive bad breath was so common that it was simply endured, much like the general odour of unwashed bodies. You now understand why the use of strongly scented tobacco snuff and floral-scented handkerchiefs was so popular, not just to mask the palace's external stench, but to create a private buffer against the close proximity of rotten mouths. As you contemplate the irony of such wealth leading directly to such suffering, you encounter the relevant scholarly debate phrase. Historians still argue whether the extreme sugar consumption was driven purely by taste and accessibility, or by a calculated desire to publicly display immense wealth and control over colonial trade. The argument suggests that since sugar was tied directly to the slave labour colonial economy, consuming vast amounts of it was a non-verbal political statement, a glorious, delicious, and highly visible way to flaunt one's participation in and benefit from the wealth of the French Empire. The resultant rotten teeth were, in this light, a strange kind of badge of honour, a physical scar proving one's unlimited access to the globe's most expensive commodity. The dental decay also had consequences for their overall health. Chronic oral infections contributed to systemic problems, making them more susceptible to the fevers and illnesses that constantly plagued the palace. Their inability to chew properly, due to pain and missing teeth, also meant that they were forced to rely on soft, easily digestible foods, often the very rich, buttery, and heavily sugared items that perpetuated a cycle of decay. The image that you can't shake is the juxtaposition of a noble lady, adorned in brilliant diamonds and magnificent towering wig, whispering secrets behind a jewelled fan, but whose breath is undeniably sweet and rotten, and whose genuine smile is a terrifying glimpse of black decay and perhaps the teeth of a dead stranger. The pursuit of pleasure, manifested through the consumption of sugar, was a silent, slow-motion self-mutilation that stripped away the beauty of their faces, one agonizing youth at a time. You've explored the disgusting inner life of the French aristocrats, but their repulsive existence was merely a reflection, albeit a gilded one, of the larger, terrifying filth of the world just outside their palace doors. You must now step away from the relative containment of Versailles or the noble hotel and confront the absolute environmental horror of the 18th century French streets, particularly in major urban centres like Paris. This environment was not simply dirty, it was a teeming open sewer, a continuous breeding ground for disease. The central, inescapable mainstream historical fact is that French cities lacked any form of organised underground sewage system for domestic waste. This meant that the streets themselves became the primary repository for almost all the detritus of urban life. Human excrement, household slops, animal waste, slaughterhouse offal, and industrial runoff. The cobbled streets were not just stained, they were perpetually coated with a viscous, foul-smelling layer of refuse, particularly in the poorly paved side alleys. Recall the noble's casual habit of dumping the contents of chamber pots out the window. That sewage would join the massive cumulative flow of waste that had nowhere to go but down the centre of the street. In many areas, a central channel or ruisseau existed, but it was essentially an open sewer, flowing sluggishly and often backing up, especially after a rain shower that would turn the streets into truly putrid, unnavigable torrents of muck. The height of the buildings and the narrowness of the streets ensured that sunlight and fresh air rarely reached the ground level, trapping the heavy, sickly sweet stench of decomposition and human waste. For the poor, this was an unavoidable daily horror. But for the aristocracy, this created a shocking paradox. They would emerge from their perfumed silk-draped carriages and have to navigate this environmental disaster. The delicate, high-heeled shoes, the mark of their leisure, were utterly unsuited for this environment. Nobles were constantly at risk of splashing mud and human waste onto their expensive, unwashed silks, turning their already unhygienic clothing into mobile petri dishes. The presence of domestic animals exacerbated the situation. Pigs, stray dogs, remember the royal petting, now imagine the strays, and horses were ubiquitous in the urban environment. Horses, pulling the coaches, left massive amounts of manure, which mixed with the human waste to form a highly infectious sludge. This was then further churned up by the constant traffic of carriages and pedestrians. The air you breathe as you stand on a Parisian street corner is thick with the smell of ammonia, sulphur, and rot, a suffocating mixture that modern urbanites would find instantly incapacitating. This pervasive filth was not just an aesthetic issue, it was the engine of endemic disease. The stagnant puddles and open waste streams were the perfect breeding ground for rats, flies, and mosquitoes, vectors for the very epidemics that periodically decimated the population. Recall the great leveller of disease we are yet to detail. The streets were the nexus where all the unsanitary practices of the city converged to create a deadly cocktail of infection. We find a particularly unsettling quirky or fringe tidbit related to the social navigation of this urban squalor, the widespread employment of professional street porters and mud jumpers. Because the noble was unwilling to soil their expensive attire in delicate shoes, they would hire these most-status individuals to literally carry them across the worst intersections, or to lay down planks and stones so the noble could hop across the stream of sewage. The mud jumper was a human bridge, a necessary but highly scorned servant of aristocratic vanity. This bizarre job highlights the extreme lengths the aristocratica went to preserve the appearance of cleanliness and detachment, while literally paying a person to wallow in the filth they created. The conditions of the streets also directly impacted the food supply. Vendors sold produce and meat right there, next to the flowing sewage, exposed to flies and the general grime. Meat, often slaughtered nearby, was handled with zero sanitation. The lack of clean market spaces meant that the filth of the streets inevitably found its way onto the aristocratic table, a final sickening dose of environmental contamination. The sheer scale of the waste problem brings us to an unavoidable scholarly debate phrase. Historians still argue whether the persistent failure to implement public sanitation projects was due to the aristocracy's prioritization of military spending, or a fundamental philosophical resistance to state intervention in private life. Some scholars claim that the state simply could not afford the vast engineering works like the London or Roman sewers due to the perpetual state of European war and the costs of maintaining a court. Others suggest a deeper, cultural resistance to the idea of a centralized secular government managing domestic waste, which was seen as a private household concern. Regardless of the cause, the effect was a city where the most powerful people in the world willingly lived amidst a biological catastrophe. As you stand here, smelling the sharp acidic tang of decay, you feel the physical presence of the environment pressing in. The mud is not just dirt, it's concentrated biological horror. You realize that the French aristocracy, in their magnificent coats and powdered wigs, were wading through a world of filth that would make a modern person instantly sick. Their ability to tolerate it was not a sign of hardiness, but a chilling testament to their indifference to the lives of the poor, and the profound self-destructive ignorance that allowed them to treat their entire world as a gigantic, disposable latrine. You've traced the path of filth from the aristocratic body to the public streets, realizing that the entire system was a magnificent, yet fragile, structure built on squalor. Now, you must confront the hidden engine of this machine, the vast unseen army of servants whose labour was essential to maintaining the illusion of aristocratic cleanliness, but whose own lives were defined by dirt, danger, and disease. They were the true invisible victims of the nobles' disgusting habits. A powerful and necessary mainstream historical fact is that the French aristocracy's luxurious life required enormous domestic staff. A major noble might employ dozens, sometimes hundreds of servants, from high-ranking valets and femmes de chambre to the lowest-ranking scullery maids and stable boys. This massive workforce was required to manage the nobles' layered wardrobe. Remember those unwashed silks? And to prepare the complex meals, attend to the elaborate rituals like the levee, and, most critically, to handle the mountains of human and animal waste the household produced. The lives of these servants were a constant, grueling confrontation with filth. They were the ones who emptied the chamber pots, often multiple times a day. Recall the horror of the piss pots and the guerlot call. They scraped the soiled food scraps from the dining tables, the dining decadence remnants, and disposed of the dirty straw bedding from the beds in the stables. Their hands were perpetually soiled, their clothing perpetually damp and foul-smelling, and their exposure to microbial life was absolute. They handled the nobles' linen, often soiled with sweat and sometimes worse, and carried the heavy, infected contents of the cesspits. Their living conditions were deplorable, a stark, unsanitary contrast to the gilded rooms they tended. Servant quarters were typically located in the hottest, least ventilated spaces, attics or damp, dark basements, often directly above or near the kitchens and cesspits, concentrating the odours, heat, and insects. These crowded, windowless rooms were a breeding ground for every disease the palace harboured. The noble might fear contracting an illness, but the servant lived in a permanent state of high risk. The constant handling of human waste also meant that the servants were the primary sufferers of waterborne diseases, the consequence of the water crisis. They drank the cheapest, most readily available and most polluted water, and their close, constant contact with the nobles' contaminated clothing and excreta ensured that when an epidemic swept for the palace, the mortality rate among the staff was exponentially higher than among their masters. The noble's fever was often the servant's death sentence. This brings us to a specific, unsettling, quirky or fringe tidbit related to the lowest-ranking staff, the groom of the stool and equivalent positions. While less formalized in 18th century France than in the English court, the reality of the closest, most intimate service existed. The groom of the stool was historically tasked with assisting the monarch with defecation, a position of shockingly high political trust because of its constant proximity to the king's person. The quirk is the paradox. A job defined by the handling of excrement and the most private physical functions was often a stepping stone to great influence and wealth. It reveals that the ultimate form of power was the noble's complete willingness to make another human being deal with their most disgusting base reality. The servant's body was, in this sense, seen as an extension of the noble's waste disposal mechanism. The servants were not just cleaning the filth, they were often responsible for creating the illusion of cleanliness. They were the ones who tirelessly brushed the unwashed silks, reapplied the heavy powders, and fanned the scented air to keep the palace presentable. This effort masked the systemic failure of sanitation from the noble, and ensured the noble could maintain their self-deception about their own superior cleanliness. They outsourced not only the labour but the very awareness of the dirt. As you reflect on the hierarchy of filth and the servant's place in it, a key scholarly debate phrase emerges. Historians still argue whether the aristocracy's neglect of their servants' health was rooted in genuine class indifference or a necessary practical acceptance of the high mortality endemic to the era's urban life. Some argue that the noble, accustomed to the cheapness of labour and the ubiquity of death, simply saw the servant as disposable, a tool easily replaced. Others posit that the diseases were so rampant and medical understanding so primitive that even if the nobles had cared, they lacked the scientific means to improve their staff's health significantly. The most damning realization, however, is that the nobles actively chose to concentrate the filth in the servants' quarters and make their staff the primary handlers of contagion. The servants' own meagre possessions and clothing were also perpetually contaminated. They lacked the means to buy new clothes and the facilities to wash their own garments properly. Their linen, if they had any, was washed in polluted water and dried in damp, sunless areas. Thus, the noble was constantly being attended to by people whose bodies and clothes were a source of the very pathogens they were trying to avoid. The ultimate tragedy is that these invisible victims were essential for the entire system to function. The sheer volume of waste. Remember that minimum of 150,000 characters of total filth would have instantly overwhelmed the palace without the tireless, disgusted and often sickening work of the domestic staff. Their labour brought the aristocracy a few extra hours of perfumed delusion before the underlying rot of their unhygienic lifestyle consumed them all. They were the living, breathing proof that the noble's magnificent world was utterly dependent on the darkest, dirtiest corners of human existence. You've witnessed the physical reality of aristocratic life, the stench, the bugs, the unmanaged waste, and the people whose job it was to manage it. And now you must consider the one thing that kept this disgusting world from descending into total anarchy: the elaborate, beautiful, and utterly false facade of manners and etiquette. This rigid social code was the aristocracy's most sophisticated tool for denying the physical filth that surrounded them, creating a delicate, intricate performance designed to glide gracefully over the muck. The central paradox is that the French courtly etiquette, which became the standard for all of Europe, and as a mainstream historical fact, was developed in direct response to the squalor of the palace. Since the environment was inherently foul, recall the pervasive stench of Versailles, manners served as a set of rules for social distancing and damage control, ensuring that one's neighbour's disgusting reality did not impinge too heavily on one's own performance of grandeur. Consider the detailed, complex rules for interaction. The bow, the curtsy, and the elaborate forms of address were not just about respect. They maintained a physical and psychological distance. When you greeted someone, the deep reverence of the bow might be a way of politely leaning away from their powerful body odour, or the cloud of insect-infested wood powder. Remember the lice mansions. Etiquette was the noble's primary defence mechanism against the unavoidable sensory assault of their world. The use of the handkerchief, often a beautiful piece of lace and silk, was a key component of this facade. It was held close to the face, ostensibly as a fashionable accessory. In reality, it was a portable, perfumed barrier. The handkerchief, scented with heavy florals or musk, was used to discreetly wipe one's nose, the contents of which would be discreetly flicked away or deposited in the pocket, and, more importantly, to press against one's own nose when a particularly foul scent wafted by, perhaps the smell of unwashed breeches or the inevitable odour rising from the floor. At the dinner table, where we previously saw the shocking lack of true hygiene, recall the hands in the shared dishes. Manners provided a social script for behaviour that superseded cleanliness. While using a fork was becoming more common, the way you held your body and the conversation you sustained was more important than the cleanliness of your hands. The elaborate decorative napkins, used sparingly, were a signal of rank, not a tool for rigorous cleaning. The art was to eat excessively, the dining decadence, while appearing delicate and refined, completely ignoring the spittle and discarded bones beneath the table. This leads us to a specific, almost unbelievable quirky or fringe tidbit that reveals the depth of this denial: the etiquette of polite spitting. In this era, due to the high consumption of snuff, remember the snuff to mask the stench, and the various respiratory ailments caused by poor air quality, spitting was a frequent and necessary act. However, the rule was that you must not spit on a person of higher rank, and you must try to aim for a designated area, like a specific corner or a fireplace if one was available. The very existence of rules for the proper way to spit demonstrates the extent to which basic, disgusting bodily functions were not eliminated, but merely codified into the performance of politeness. The noble performed the act of expelling bodily fluid, and the goal of etiquette was simply to make the recipient pretend they hadn't noticed. Even the way they managed social space was a function of masking filth. The grand salons, with their high ceilings and wide doorways, were designed for sweeping entrances and exits, minimizing the time spent in stagnant, odorous clusters. Courtiers were taught to move in a particular deliberate glide, avoiding abrupt movements that might draw attention to their own heavy clothing, or the filth on the floor, recall the sewage and slop of the streets. The sheer impracticality of their clothing, the layers of germs, necessitated a careful, restrained, and highly mannered mode of walking. The purpose of etiquette, therefore, was to establish a collective agreement to ignore the physical reality of their lives. It was a social contract that said, "We are all stinking and sick and covered in dirt, but we will collectively behave as if we are exquisite beings, and anyone who draws attention to the truth is the one who has committed the true social offence." This denial of physical reality brings us to the crucial scholarly debate phrase. Historians still argue whether the extreme formality of French aristocratic etiquette was a product of the Catholic Church's emphasis on bodily restraint, or a secular invention designed to differentiate the nobility from the gross physicality of the peasantry. Some scholars link the suppression of natural urges and the formalizing of public life to religious concepts of purity and control. Others maintain that it was a clear-cut social weapon, by creating an intricate code that required decades to master and vast wealth to execute in clothing, language, and knowledge. The nobility created an impenetrable barrier between themselves and the hoi polloi, whose lives were defined by physical labour, simpler clothes, and a lack of refined bodily control. The disgusting reality of their bodies was shared with the peasants, but the peasants lacked the complex social scripts to hide it. The facade of manners was ultimately a demonstration of power over self and others. The noble, who could maintain a flawless, graceful demeanour while standing in a room that smelled faintly of chamber pot and unwashed bodies, proved that their willpower and social status transcended mere physical reality. It was a victory of appearance over substance. In a world without sanitation, manners became the most important form of social hygiene. If you couldn't clean the palace, you cleaned up the behaviour within the palace. The final heartbreaking image of this section is of a young woman who has just spent a harrowing evening trying to maintain her composure, returning to her tiny, crowded room, stripping off her stifling, unwashed gown, and sinking onto her vermin-infested bed, utterly exhausted from the relentless performance required to ignore the very world she was living in. The facade was glamorous, but the effort to maintain it was truly draining, a continuous psychological toll paid for the privilege of rank. You have seen the aristocracy cloak their physical squalor in an exquisite veil of manners and wealth, but no amount of etiquette or perfume could defend them from the invisible enemy that their lifestyle actively invited: disease. The constant threat of epidemics was the great leveller, a mainstream historical fact that proved wealth offered no genuine immunity against a microbe. Their magnificent homes and unhygienic habits made them perfect targets for the deadliest contagions of the era. The palace and the surrounding cities were, as we have established, a perfect breeding ground for disease, a combination of crowded conditions, poor ventilation, contaminated water, and pervasive human and animal waste. The aristocratic body, compromised by a terrible sugar-heavy diet and weakened by aggressive medical malpractice like bleeding in purging, recall the medical mayhem, was ill-equipped to fight back. The most terrifying and common scourge was smallpox, la petite verole. It ravaged all social classes, but the aristocracy, with their constant close contact in unventilated rooms, remember the constant publicity of daily life, and their practice of receiving visitors while ill ensured its swift transmission. You can vividly picture the fear that swept through Versailles whenever a courtier developed the telltale fever and pustules. Survival often meant disfigurement, leading to the necessity of the facial patch, or mouche, we discussed earlier. The death of a high-ranking noble or royal family member from smallpox was a regular shattering event that exposed the utter fragility of their power. Louis XV, the predecessor of Louis XVI, famously died of smallpox, demonstrating that even the divinely anointed king was merely a vessel for the virus. Beyond smallpox, they were constant targets for typhus, carried by the body lice that thrived in their unwashed wigs and layered clothing. The lice mansions, and in the crowded dirty quarters of their servants, the invisible victims. They were struck by dysentery and cholera transmitted through the water supply and contaminated food, the water crisis and the dining decadence. And they were susceptible to tuberculosis, a respiratory illness that flourished in the stuffy, stale air of their heavily draped, curtained, and unventilated bedchambers, the unsanitary sleep environments. The aristocratic response to illness was a bizarre mix of fatalism and superstition. They would, of course, summon their physicians, who would apply the same ineffective and dangerous treatments, exacerbating the problem. But they also resorted to religious relics, amulets, and bizarre folk remedies. The disease was not seen as a biological problem, but as a stroke of fate, a punishment, or a mysterious internal imbalance. This brings us to a specific, almost darkly ironic, quirky or fringe tidbit: the use of plague pits or mass graves even near the royal residences. While the French crown sometimes implemented quarantines, a rudimentary yet effective form of public health, when a true epidemic struck, the sheer volume of aristocratic dead, often handled by the low-ranking servants, who were also dying, necessitated mass disposal. The quirk is the reality that these nobles, who lived their lives demanding the most exquisite individual attention and burial rites, would, in the chaos of a true plague, be unceremoniously dumped into a common pit, a final, horrifying democratic gesture from the disease they tried so hard to deny. Their individual magnificence was instantly negated by the collective microbial reality of their unsanitary world. You realize that their entire lifestyle was designed to concentrate and incubate pathogens. The system of political proximity, the endless requirement to be physically near the king or influential nobles, the lack of private space, meant that once a disease entered the court, it spread with lightning speed through the dense, unhygienic population. The sheer frequency of disease caused by their own habits, from common colds to fatal fevers, meant that the aristocracy spent a significant portion of their lives either actively sick, recovering, or in perpetual fear of the next outbreak. This constant health anxiety contrasted violently with their public performance of effortless luxury. Recall the manners facade, creating a deep, neurotic strain beneath the surface of courtly grace. This widespread vulnerability to disease introduces the critical scholarly debate phrase. Historians still argue whether the aristocracy's persistent failure to adopt preventative hygiene measures was due to a genuine scientific skepticism of germ theory precursors, or a fatalistic acceptance of a high disease burden as an unchangeable condition of life. Some scholars suggest that since medicine offered no cures, the noble adopted a posture of fatalistic acceptance. Why bother with an unpleasant bath if you're going to die of typhus anyway? Others argue that the entrenched belief in humoral theory was so powerful that any advice to simply wash one's hands or open a window was viewed as intellectually naive compared to the complex, learned process of bloodletting. Either way, the result was a willful ignorance that ensured the epidemics would return, again and again. The final irony is that disease was the one social force that completely ignored the elaborate class structure. A servant might die of typhus contracted from the lice in the master's wig, and the master might then die from the same disease contracted from his own unwashed clothes, proving that no amount of privilege could truly sanitize a life lived without basic hygiene. The same microorganisms thrived equally in the silk-lined mattress and the straw-filled pallet. As you contemplate the constant presence of illness, you realize that the French aristocracy was always on the verge of biological collapse. Their obsession with magnificent appearance and their profound indifference to physical cleanliness meant they were living on a razor's edge, constantly tempting the deadly forces of nature. The next time the fever struck, it would bring with it not just physical agony, but the spectre of the end of their gilded, disgusting world. You have endured the full spectrum of the aristocracy's magnificent filth, their unwashed bodies, their vermin-infested wigs, their sewage-soaked palaces, and the diseases that constantly threaten to end their performance. As we reach the final act, you realize that the pervasive, unmanaged squalor was not just a personal failing, it was a visible, tangible symbol of the decadence and detachment that fueled the ultimate catastrophe, the French Revolution. The stench of their lives became the smell of their doom. The central, tragic mainstream historical fact that connects aristocratic filth to the revolution is the palpable disconnect between the nobles' extravagant display of wealth and their abject indifference to the fundamental health and suffering of the vast majority of the French populace. While the nobleman was spending a fortune on silk and musk perfume to mask the stink of his own unwashed body and unemptied chamber pot, the common people were dying in their thousands from typhus and cholera, diseases rooted in the very environmental filth that the aristocracy chose to ignore, or worse, actively contributed to. Recall the open sewers and slop of the streets. The sight of a gilded carriage splashing human waste onto a poor laundress was not just an inconvenience, it was a potent visual metaphor for the moral corruption of the entire regime. The revolutionary pamphlets and popular sentiment leading up to 1789 frequently seized upon this visceral physical disgust. The aristocracy was portrayed not just as politically oppressive, but as physically rotten, their excess leading to decay both in their bodies and in the body politic. The towering powdered wigs and heavy makeup which you now know were used to conceal dirt, lice and smallpox scars, the royal toilette, perfume over pox, were mocked as grotesque, artificial attempts to cover a fundamental, terminal moral sickness. The image of the king and queen living in luxurious filth while the nation starved provided a concrete sensory justification for the anger of the people. The irony is profound. Their greatest luxuries, the unwashed silks, the sweet foods that rotted their teeth, the elaborate court rituals that prevented them from ever being clean, were the very things that sealed their fate. They were too invested in the illusion of their superiority to save themselves with the simplest of actions, washing their hands, cleaning their homes, and addressing the sanitation crisis. They continued to value the appearance of power over the reality of public health. Now, we introduce a powerful final quirky or fringe tidbit that perfectly encapsulates this doomed obliviousness, Marie Antoinette's model dairy in the pastoral fantasy. In the years before the Revolution, the Queen, seeking an escape from the formalities of Versailles and the stench of court, remember the public indignity, built a quaint rustic hamlet in the palace grounds, the Hamas de la Reine. Here, she and her ladies would play at being milkmaids and shepherdesses, wearing simple but still expensive muslin dresses and pretending to lead a clean pastoral life. The quirk is that the cows and sheep in this idealized, meticulously cleaned and perfumed farm were tended to by real servants who did all the actual dirty labour. The Queen sought to escape the palace's filth by constructing an immaculate false vision of nature, demonstrating her total lack of understanding of the real peasant life, which was mired in the filth and hardship her government created. She wanted the aesthetics of nature without the disgusting reality of it. The final days of the monarchy were a period of desperate, but ultimately doomed, efforts at reform. Louis XVI tried to control spending, and some of the more enlightened nobles began to advocate for minor hygienic improvements. But by then, the structural rot was too deep, the mentality too entrenched. The aristocratic habit of dismissing the physical world as beneath them, recall the manners façade's denial, meant they failed to recognize that the people's revolt was fundamentally about the difference between their idealized, beautiful life and the sickening reality of it. This leads us to the final, crushing scholarly debate phrase. Historians still argue whether the Thermidor reaction was truly a counter-revolution, or simply the final, violent cleansing of the physical and moral filth of the Ancien Regime. Some scholars see the subsequent reign of terror as a political power struggle that spiraled out of control. Others view the violence, particularly the symbolic act of guillotining the royalty and nobility, as a necessary, total purge, a violent attempt to excise the visible, contaminated body of the noble class that had proven so resistant to reform. The revolution was not just about abstract rights. It was about the palpable, nauseating difference between the gilded few and the suffering many. The final fatal blow was delivered not just to their power, but to their grotesque, self-serving, and utterly unsanitary way of life. The guillotine, in its cold, mechanical efficiency, offered a final grim form of hygiene, a quick, final separation of the rotting head from the aristocratic body. The ultimate act of the revolution was to forcibly end the performance, to strip away the silks and the wigs, and to expose the physical reality beneath, a reality that the nobility had spent centuries trying to hide beneath layers of perfumed powder and political pretense. The gilded cage of Versailles was abandoned, its magnificent halls eventually aired out and scrubbed, but the stench of that era, the smell of corruption, of musk, of unemptied pots, of lice, and of wilful ignorance, would cling to the historical memory of the French aristocracy forever. Their reign ended not with a bang of moral clarity, but with the sickening smell of their own unmanaged waste. The whispers soften now, as the final echo of that tumultuous age fades into the quiet. You can breathe easier. The heavy, cawing air of Versailles is gone, replaced by the cool, clean stillness of your own room. The image of the stinking, spectacular court, the endless gold, the crawling things, the hidden decay, is a history lesson that appeals to the deepest, most primal parts of your memory, reminding you that true wealth is not found in unwashed silks, but in a simple bar of soap, a clear pane of glass, and a breath of fresh, uncontaminated air. Let the weight of that strange, disgusting world lift from you now. Feel the soft comfort of your pillow, the clean sheets beneath your hand. All those scents, the sweat and the musk and the ancient grime, belong to a time long past. Tonight, you sleep in a world that, for all its problems, understands the simple, life-giving power of cleanliness. Let the silence in your room wash over you, a final calming current, carrying away the lingering discomfort of our journey.